All right, class, let's jump in here into chapter 10, assessing flexibility. Um, we first thing we want to talk about is number one, flexibility is a really often overlooked facet of health and fitness, right? So myself included, I don't work on my flexibility near as much as I should, easy for me to say, near as much as I should. And I know a number of my clients, I know a number of really athletic people that I work with that would say the same thing. You know, they don't focus on their flexibility as much as they should, but it has a massive impact on your overall health and fitness. It's got a massive impact on your functional range of motion, which is going to impact how well you're able to lift, which then in turn impacts the ceiling that you have of strength gains here, right? So it's a really important piece of overall health and fitness, but it's not a really well researched area. So if there are any of you out there that are maybe interested in becoming professors or entering academia regarding health and fitness, flexibility is a great way to go here. So there's kind of two ranges of flexibility or lack of flexibility, right? So you got ankylosis, which is massive lack of flexibility, and then you've got hypermobility, which is the people who are, naturally flexible, and even to the point of maybe being too flexible, going beyond what a healthy range of motion would be. So what actually is flexibility? It's defined as your ability to move a particular joint through a full range of motion. And we've got static and dynamic flexibility. And your range of motion, that full range of motion, is going to be different based on each person, right? Because your range of motion is going to be affected by the joint structure. So we know we've got some genetic predisposition to joint shape. Some people, let's look at the hip, for example, have really, really deep acetabulums, while some have really shallow, which is going to impact the range of motion that you've got there at your hips. Same thing with your shoulders. So joint structure along with the tightness of the soft tissue around the structure. So let's take a look here a little bit more at what some of the factors that are going to be affecting your flexibility are beyond just those two. The other two that are going to be impacting your flexibility are your body composition, right? So you can imagine that somebody who is severely overweight or obese is not really going to be able to move through a range of motion quite as well as somebody who significantly thinner or more fit individual, just due to the mass that is actually surrounding that particular joint structure. And then lastly, age. So we know as we get older, our soft tissue starts to break down. We maybe start to experience some arthritis, along with maybe some bone structure breaking down, which is going to change maybe the actual structure of the joint itself. Also sex. So our hormonal makeup between males and females is different, which means that females generally have more lax soft tissue, excuse me, than men do. Which means that as a general rule, you'll see significantly more freedom to move through ranges of motion in females than you will males, all things being equal, meaning they both train flexibility, etc. Physical activity versus inactivity. So again, somebody who's physically active, their soft tissue is most likely to be much more mobile. They've got probably healthy joint structures. Versus inactivity, a sedentary lifestyle can start to impact a lot of these and impact your flexibility. And then lastly, muscle temperature, right? So we can imagine that if our soft tissues, muscles and tendons surrounding joints are like a rubber band, if we put that rubber band in the freezer, it's going to not have quite as much laxity as if that rubber band is sitting at room temperature or maybe a little bit warmer than that. That's why it's really important before you start to do any flexibility program to warm up your muscles before you start to dive into it too deeply, as that can have a massive impact on your flexibility. Now, we talked at the beginning about excessive flexibility or hypermobility being an issue. So why could this possibly be an issue, right? Well, the number one reason is that our joints are structured in a way to only go through a specific set or a certain healthy range of motion. Now, if our joint structures or our soft tissue surrounding those joints allow us to move beyond that healthy range of motion, we can start to lose some of the integrity and the structure of that joint, which then can lead to a subluxation, which is really just like if this were our shoulder joint, kind of a ball and socket, just pop out and then immediately return back into the joint, or a full dislocation where the joint is actually dislocated and does not return back to its original healthy position on its own. So you can imagine, there's lots of issues that that can come into place here, especially when you're starting to lift and your load gets heavier. If you don't have appropriate or proper stabilization around that joint, you can start to lose some of that structural integrity. You've got a significant risk for injury there. And then, of course, we know with subluxations and dislocations in particular joints, once that starts to happen, the likelihood of it happening again becomes higher and higher. So how do we test flexibility? Number one, we're going to be looking at dynamic flexibility and static flexibility. So dynamic flexibility is going to be measuring the resistance of your muscle during a muscle elongation, right? So dynamic flexibility would be like how high can I lift my leg on my own, using my own muscles. How high can I lift my leg, and what's the range of motion there that I'm able to reach on my own. Static flexibility would be, I'm lying down and somebody is either bringing my leg, if we're still looking at the hamstring, bringing my leg up to a specific point and seeing how far I can bring that through the range of motion there. So there's three tools that we're going to look at. Three tools that are available, but two primarily, the goniometer and the flexometer. There's also an inclinometer, but we don't really come across that too much, that are going to measure your joint range of motion in degrees. So here's an example of what a goniometer would be. We place the hinge point of the goniometer right at the hinge point of the joint, and then we're able to track the angle of this joint as our client moves through a particular range of motion. So we see here that client is actively bringing their knee up towards their butt, and that's going to change the joint angle here, so we're able to measure what the flexibility of that particular joint would be. And then we see that here at the wrist, and checking elbow mobility here, and then we see these inclinometers checking spine mobility. Now, general guidelines for testing flexibility of joints. Number one, you want to make sure that the tool that you're using to test the joint range of motion is the appropriate one. So flexibility is going to be joint specific, right? I'm not going to have the same natural range of motion at my ankle that I am going to have at my shoulder, or I'm not going to have the same natural range of motion at my elbow that I am going to have at my hip, right? So important to make sure that we're testing appropriately for the joint that we want to. Number two, you actually want to warm up a bit before you're doing your flexibility test and actually do some static stretching. We want to test warm muscles that would be in a natural state, not a cold state, for that same reason that we know muscle temperature can actually impact the range of motion and flexibility here. We're going to want to test each joint 3 times. That's just good standard scientific practice. Make sure we're getting consistent readings. We want to compare it not just to norms of your client, but also to age norms, right? So where do you fall in the general guidelines of where you should be? So that ideally we can then identify areas that we need to improve through our program. The other thing that we're going to look at this week is the sit and reach, and there's variations of that. What we're going to be using is the V-sit or the YMCA yardstick. So we see pictures here of these boxes. These are great. I have terrible hip and hamstring mobility, so I always dreaded this test in school or during fitness assessments, but we can see this client is sitting up against the wall. Feet are flat as well as their back. And then we've got the measurement right here at their fingertips, right at the end of their fingertips, and then they can just reach and push the slider forward in order to get a measurement here. We can modify this test, right? So we can do the single leg sit and reach. We can also have a client on a bench if this is more comfortable for them. And this is actually going to be what the YMCA sit and reach is going to be much more closely attributed to. So you see the yardstick there that they're using to measure full range of motion in the sit and reach. Now, if you're training older clients, we know that getting up and down off the floor may not be the easiest thing to do. Balance may not be great. We're probably not looking at a major or super wide range of motion here. So for older clients, we can do a modified chair sit and reach. So that's where you're going to have your client sit at the edge of a chair with one leg extended. Again, we want to make sure that these clients have a stable base to work off of, with one leg extended out in front of them with the heel on the floor, ankle in full dorsiflexion, and then they'll only use trunk flexion to reach towards their toes. Now you basically are measuring the reach from their toe. If it's beyond their toe, that's going to be a positive marker. If it's short of their toe, then it's going to be a negative marker. But we can see a great example of this here. So they've got the ruler. You can basically put the ruler at, say, 6 or 8 inches here. So just a couple of inches going beyond the toe, as that's going to be probably a pretty significant stretch there. And then measuring a negative value short of the toe and a positive value beyond the toe, making sure that they're only using trunk flexion here. The other way that we can kind of modify some shoulder mobility here for clients is looking at the back scratch, right? So the back scratch is actually a fantastic shoulder mobility test for clients of all ages. This is a really standard test in the functional movement systems. If you guys have ever heard of that, with Greg Cook, it's a fantastic movement assessment. A lot of professional franchises use this to measure the movement health of their clients. But basically, you'll have a client standing up, and they'll either create fists, or in older clients, we can do it with open hands, and they'll measure the distance between their middle fingers when they reach over their shoulder. So their right arm will reach over down the middle of their back, their left arm will reach down and behind, up the middle of their back, and then again, you're measuring any overlap being a positive value, any negative or space between the two fingers being a negative value, and that's going to look just like this. Now, it's important to set some standards here when you're doing this. When you're measuring older client shoulder mobility this way, you always want to be assigning the value to the number, or to the shoulder rather, that's reaching over the top. So when I go like this, I don't know if it's reversed or not for you guys, but this would be a right shoulder mobility assessment, and this would be a left shoulder mobility assessment. And you can probably even see my posture when I start to do that. Very easy for the right shoulder to go over the top, very difficult for the right shoulder to go back underneath, as I've got a lot of rounding here. So that's pretty much it for joint assessment, flexibility assessment. Pretty straightforward. There's lots of great resources. Again, I would highly recommend you guys looking into functional movement systems. It's a fantastic methodology for approaching movement health, and particularly as flexibility impacts functional movement and being able to train in appropriate ranges of motion. So I'm going to wrap this up, and I'll see you guys at Chapter 11.